friends, welcome back to the channel. So this is very late, but I'm doing it nonetheless. So I just decided to put together my list of my favorite reads of 2022. And I always struggle with this every year because, you know, I'm not really sure where I should rank things, and I end up thinking that a lot of them should be at number one. So I decided to do it a little bit differently this year, and I've done a couple of different categories. So I wanted to highlight some variety in there as well and not pick just adult horror, just YA, which you guys know that I read a lot of YA. So I've gone ahead and put together several different categories, and hopefully you guys enjoy this list. They're in no particular order. There's not like a number 10 to a number 1 or anything like this, just the different categories. So I do like to support the independent author community here on BookTube, and so I've put together a category of independently published books, and some of these books kind of are crossed over a little bit. So some of them are independently published, but they're in other categories, and some of them I put in this category, so you'll see a little bit of crossover there. But the two that I picked for the independently published books are books that are 5 stars and blew me out of the water. I still think about them. I still think about these stories, both of them. And the first one is The Hay Bale by Priscilla Bettis. This is actually a very short novelette. I would recommend everyone downloading it off of Amazon and giving it a read. It's only about 52 or 58 pages, but it is a spectacular story about a woman who is going through some stuff in her life, and to sort of get away, she decides to rent a house in the Deep South. So this is a Southern Gothic horror, and there's a mysterious hay bale out back. And I can't say too much about this because, like I said, it's such a short book, but the creep factor, the writing, the ending, just the whole thing is it's mind-blowing. I loved this story. It goes places where you don't think it's going to, but it does, and it's a really good examination about grief in one aspect, and just solidly written. Priscilla is fantastic. Unfortunately, I couldn't read her new book. It's called Dog Meat, and can't do it. So unfortunately I had to skip that one. But The Hay Bale is absolutely fantastic. I read it, I believe, last February, so it's been almost a year, and I still, you know, every now and again the story will come into my head. So that one is absolutely fantastic. And then the other book that I picked is Mandy by Stephanie Sparks. So Stephanie Sparks is increasingly climbing up my favorite authors list. Everything she's put out I've loved. So I think I read 3 books by her this year. I also read The Stepchildren and Scream Queen. But out of the 3 that I read this year, this one really stuck out in my mind. And I think it's because, number one, the story itself is very twisty-turny. It's non-stop. It's graphic and gruesome. It has a great twist ending, but I think it's also because of the subject matter. It's very difficult subject matter, and it's written really well. She does a very good job at keeping things tasteful with the subject matter. So this is about Mandy Fisher, and she's not like other girls, and she works in a funeral home with her father, and one night she gets a knock on the door where there's a young man, and he's very upset, and he says that his friend has died, and he knows that Mandy has the ability to bring people back from the dead. And so the story kind of starts there, but Mandy doesn't know what she's bringing back. So this person, and I think the character in here that Mandy ends up bringing back is the best antagonist I have ever read. I hated this person. I hated this person so much. So that's fantastic. This is, you know, Stephanie Sparks and this book Mandy are really underappreciated, and I think everyone should give this a read. It's just a you know, very short novel, about 170 something pages. So highly recommend it, and full 5 stars. Definitely deserves a spot on my top reads of 2020. And then I did a category for each of middle grade horror, YA horror, and adult horror. So in those categories, starting off with middle grade, my best middle grade book of the year, even though I read a lot of my favorites out of the Last Apprentice series, I believe I reread the first 7 books in that series. So out of all of those and all of the middle grade that I've read, because I tend to read a lot of it, I had to go with this one, The Time Watchers by Robbie Miles. This book was so fantastic. I did a full reading vlog on it, so if you look back, you guys can find my reading vlog for this book. I did a whole like sleepover theme with like Halloween treats and all of that, and like the cover on this book is fantastic. The story is fantastic. The nostalgia factor was fantastic, which is something that I really look for in a lot of my reads. And so that's easily why I picked this one to be my top middle grade of the year. And if you have baby bats at home and you love Halloween or they love Halloween, I would highly recommend this one. So this follows Amy, Sam, and Jack, who are best friends, and they decide, so Halloween falls on a Saturday, so they decide to have a whole Halloween weekend extravaganza. They have a sleepover with the pizza and popcorn and movies and telling scary stories and the whole thing. And they start talking about the legend of the Time Watcher, and they all go to sleep on the Friday night, and then one of them ends up missing. So the other 2 have to go rescue their friend, and they meet along the way lots of ghoulies and ghosties and witches and all of that sort of thing. And right at the end of this book, there's a total Halloween explosion. I loved this one from cover to cover. Like I said, the cover art itself is beautiful, the story is beautiful, the message of friendship and love, overcoming pretty much everything, it's fantastic. It's a nostalgia bomb. So if you like all of those things, you will definitely like this one. So in the YA category, I have 2 books. And the first one, actually both of these are vampire books. So the first one is In Every Generation by Kendara Blake. The second book in this series is coming out at the end of January. I'm currently on a book buying ban, so I'm trying to hold strong and not buy it for myself. But this one, I was very cautiously optimistic. I bought it and then it sat on my shelf for a couple of months before I picked it up, because I find that a lot of Buffy fan fiction they just don't do the story justice. They really don't. It doesn't feel like Sunnydale. It doesn't feel like Buffy. It doesn't, it doesn't have a lot of the same characters and all of that sort of thing. So this particular one actually follows Willow's daughter. So Willow's daughter is the first witch slayer, I guess you would say. And so Willow is a part of the story, and I won't give anything away, but there's other legacy characters that are in this story. And what I loved here was it felt like the Buffy characters. Kendara Blake really must have studied their speech patterns and the way that they did things and their mannerisms and all of that sort of thing. It felt like Sunnydale. It felt like the time period it should have been. There's a new high school. It really felt like the Scoobies and the big bads and the whole thing. I devoured this book, I think, in 2 days, and I hardly blinked the whole time. It was fantastic. So if you are a Buffy fan, which obviously I am, I would highly, highly recommend this one. And then the other book that I picked for my top YA books of the year was by my friend Amy McCaw, Mina and the Slayers. So Amy is a huge Buffy fan as well. She loves vampires. And this is the second book in her series, the Mina series. So she also wrote Mina and the Undead. So I read that one as well, obviously being the first book, and it was okay. I thought it was great. I really enjoyed the story. Had a really heavy romance aspect to it, so it kind of took away from it a little bit for me. And this one, Amy's writing just really came through. She's getting so amazing at this. And the story about Mina, who comes over to New Orleans, which New Orleans itself is sort of a character within the story. And she's staying with her sister, who works in the mansion of the macabre with her friends, and all sorts of spooky things start happening. There's murder mysteries going on, there's vampires, there's big bads, it's New Orleans, and tarot readers and all sorts of things. So I love this series. It's very much along the same lines of Buffy and that sort of story. So if you're into vampires, you're into the nostalgia factor, I would highly recommend this one because, you know, it gets a lot of love on BookTube, but I can't say enough good things about the second book in the Mina series. So like I said, book number 1 was good. This one was fantastic. And in the adult horror category, I picked 2 books. Now, I tried not to do this, but I struggled with myself and I had to do it. So both of them are Darcy Coates books. So the first one is probably my favorite Darcy Coates book. It's The Haunting of Ashburn House. So this obviously is a haunted house story. It's fantastic. And I found that by the end of the story, there was a lot of action. The story itself started to rev up. So it went from that cozy horror right into like this mystery that was kind of coming to fruition and everything, and it was fantastic. So I think I read this one in like a day. It was so good. I love Darcy Coates' writing. She does have very much of a formulaic sort of writing style, especially with her haunted house books. So this one is very cozy, it's very familiar. When I want something that's comforting and I know I'm going to enjoy, I usually go for one of Darcy Coates' haunted house sort of books. So the second one that I picked was Gallows Hill by Darcy Coates, and that one is sort of along the same lines of her other haunted house books, but it kind of breaks the formula a little bit, which over the past 2 years I've been saying, like, I hope she breaks out of her formula, which she very much has in her recent writings. So I really appreciated this. Again, Gallows Hill I read, just in a couple of days. I got a ARC copy from NetGalley and I was so happy to get it. So this one is about not a haunted house, so it's a haunted vineyard actually, but the story is so much more than that, so I'm not going to give anything away. But both of these books, especially if you're into the creepy cozy, the haunted houses and all of that, very comforting and cozy sort of writing, I would highly recommend both of these books. And then for the best anthology that I read this year, I picked The Tales from Valley View Cemetery by John Burrell. And this was such a fun anthology. So I really liked the fact that it was all different stories that were all different characters. Every story had a new character set, but all of the stories revolved around this cemetery and spooky things that happen either in or somewhere around this cemetery. And these stories went from spooky to claustrophobic to gross. So there was a little bit of something for everyone in this anthology. I don't think this one gets enough love on BookTube, so I really enjoyed this and I really wanted to put it on this list. I do tend to read short story sort of collections either around the holidays, so through Halloween and Christmas, but I also really enjoy reading them when I've gotten a little bit slumpy, and I read some really awful books this year. So this was one that I went to when I wanted to try to get out of that reading slump, and I find that short stories really helps me do that. So this one was definitely one that I was thinking about pretty much all year, and there's others in this series as well, so I'm really super excited to pick those up also. So the last 2 categories that I have are nonfiction categories, and as most of you know, I do enjoy reading and collecting vintage horror, but I also love to collect and read just vintage books of all kinds. So especially if it comes to 80s and 90s teen fiction. So for my best nonfiction book, I've got to read this for my list. It's called Paperback Crush: The Totally Radical History of 80s and 90s Teen Fiction by Gabrielle Moss. And I read this kind of in the spring going into the summer, and I got really into going for walks every day on my lunch, and I would just put in my headphones and I would smile and laugh the whole time I was reading this. So this is a nonfiction book that chronicles sort of information and a lot of these series like Babysitter's Club and Sweet Valley and all of those, R.L. Stine. that came out in the 80s and 90s. And what I really loved about this was it's a lot of the nostalgia factor of the series that I read when I was growing up, but also of a lot of series that I hadn't even heard of before. And some of those series I've actually started collecting for my own shelves at this point, because you know, there were so many back then. The 80s and 90s teen boom for, like, you know, series fiction was huge, and everybody had their own things. So I've definitely started to expand my horizons with the series that I know about, and it was just fantastic. And I know that I need to reread that book and jot down some more series that I've actually forgotten about since the last time I read it. But if you're into that sort of thing, vintage teen fiction, and you enjoy nonfiction and just informational kind of books, I would highly recommend picking that one up. And then my last category is non-horror. So this is a non-horror, non-fiction, and it is The Mother of All Degrassi by Linda Schuyler. And I am a huge Degrassi fan. So I watched Degrassi Junior High and Degrassi High when back in the 80s when I was growing up. I loved it. I think it was such an important show. It was chronicled really, really well. And of course it has that cheese factor also because it's low budget Canadian television. And then of course in the early 2000s and then right up through, I watched the Degrassi The Next Generation, Into the New Class, and all of that. I actually just finished rewatching all 16 seasons. Took me a really long time, but I just rewatched all of them from the very beginning right up until the very end, and it's just fantastic. So this book chronicles Linda Schuyler's life going from being a school teacher, how she got the idea for the show and into production and all of that. And so it was fantastic to get some of the backstory. It was fantastic to hear the story of such a fantastic female entrepreneur. And, you know, of course she talked about certain things that happened in the show that were very nostalgic because they're things that I remember from when I watched it. Spike's baby and Emma and how Emma got her name and all of this sort of thing. So I gobbled this book up. I really did. I super enjoyed it. So if you're a Degrassi fan, I would highly recommend this book to anybody who enjoys that show. It is a must read for sure, and I listened to it on audiobook, and the audiobook was fantastic. So that is it. That is it for my top reads of 2022. I hope you guys enjoyed this format. I hope I've given you some suggestions for books that you could pick up that you were wondering about or you hadn't heard of before. So if you enjoyed the video, please make sure to give me a thumbs up, leave me a question or a comment down below because you know I love chatting with you guys. But until next time, stay spooky everybody. Bye.